There is a country on this earth that contains within its borders more than 3,000 years of unbroken recorded history, a written language older than most of the world's surviving scripts. A calendar system that places the current year several years behind what the rest of the world agrees upon, and a Christian tradition that predates the Roman conversion by decades. And yet, when most people are asked to name what they know about this country, they speak about famine. That tension is not accidental. It is, in many ways, the defining paradox of Ethiopia, a civilization so ancient it was already declining from a previous golden age when Europe was still constructing its first great cathedrals. A people so deeply rooted in place and story and belief that they built structures whose engineering still confounds researchers today. A landscape so varied, from the lowest point in Africa to plateaus that brush against the upper atmosphere, that it functions less like a single country and more like a continent folded inward upon itself. And yet the image most of the world carries is simple. A single story, a single decade, a single photograph. What happens to a civilization when the world reduces it to one image? What happens to a people when their complexity is replaced by someone else's summary? And what does it mean that a country this old, this layered, this geographically extreme is still here, not as a relic, not as a museum, but as a living, functioning civilization that has never been colonized, never been erased, never stopped being itself? This is not a story about poverty. This is not a story about aid. This is the story of Ethiopia, what it actually is, what it has always been, and why understanding it requires letting go of almost everything you thought you knew. Begin with the land, because in Ethiopia, the land is not background. It is character. The Ethiopian plateau rises from the Horn of Africa like something that was not meant to exist at this latitude. At elevations exceeding 3,000 meters across wide stretches of its interior, it creates a climate that should not be possible in a country sitting so close to the equator. The air is cool. The mornings carry the particular quality of high-altitude light, thin, precise, luminous without heat. Cities like Addis Ababa sit at roughly 2,300 meters above sea level, making it one of the highest capital cities on Earth, and the country's highland regions push considerably further upward. This elevation is not incidental. It is the reason Ethiopia exists the way it does. The plateau created an environment hospitable to dense human settlement when the surrounding lowlands were brutal and often uninhabitable. It channeled rainfall in specific patterns, fed river systems that cut deep gorges through the rock, and produced agricultural conditions that supported complex societies long before comparable systems emerged elsewhere on the continent. The Blue Nile originates here, not from some remote glacial source invisible to human life, but from Lake Tana, a wide, shallow body of water in the northern highlands surrounded by ancient island monasteries that have stood for more than 6 centuries. The river leaves the lake quietly, moves south, then turns and begins its descent through a gorge of almost incomprehensible scale. The Blue Nile Gorge drops more than 1,500 meters from the plateau edge, and standing at its rim, you are looking at something that operates on geological time rather than human time. The canyon stretches across the landscape like a wound that never healed, raw, ancient, indifferent to the centuries that have passed above it. But the plateau is only one dimension of Ethiopia's geography. To the northeast, the land drops away entirely. The Afar Depression, also called the Danakil Depression, descends to more than 100 meters below sea level and produces surface temperatures that regularly exceed 50 degrees Celsius. It is one of the most geologically active places on Earth. The ground here is not stable. It is alive with volcanic vents, sulfuric pools the color of acid, salt flats that extend toward the horizon with a flat, alien quality. The Afar people have lived in and around this landscape for generations, mining salt from the flats in a practice that has continued largely unchanged for centuries. Within a single country, you move from sub-zero highland temperatures to one of the hottest inhabited places on Earth. You cross from dense highland forest to semi-desert to the Rift Valley lakes, a chain of bodies of water running down the eastern edge of the plateau that support an ecosystem of extraordinary density. Flamingos, pelicans, crocodiles, fish eagles holding position above water the color of copper and jade. The geography does not simplify, it accumulates. And this accumulation matters because Ethiopia's human history did not develop despite the landscape. It developed because of it. The isolation of the northern highlands, cut off by gorges and elevation from easy movement in multiple directions, allowed complex cultures to form without constant dissolution. The fertility of the plateau supported population densities that generated surplus, and surplus generates institutions, hierarchies, writing systems, religious organizations, monuments. The Aksumite Empire understood this before Rome had finished building the Colosseum. Aksum sits in the Tigray region of northern Ethiopia, near the current border with Eritrea, and what remains of it today is so understated that first-time visitors often describe a feeling of disorientation. The ruins are not fenced off behind tourist infrastructure. They exist within and alongside a living town. Obelisks, enormous carved stone towers called stelae, rise from a field in the center of the settlement with the quiet authority of objects that simply refuse to stop existing. The largest standing stele reaches 23 meters. Others lie where they fell, toppled by time or conflict, their carved faces still showing the architectural detail of a civilization that understood how to translate power into stone. At its height, roughly the 1st through 7th centuries of the Common Era, Aksum was one of the 4 major powers of the ancient world, alongside Rome, Persia, and China. This is not regional mythology. It is documented in the writings of Persian prophet Mani, who named Aksum explicitly among the great empires of his time. The city sat at the intersection of trade routes connecting the Mediterranean world with the Indian Ocean. Ivory, gold, obsidian, and incense passing through its markets, while its merchants traveled as far as India. The Aksumite kingdom developed its own script, Ge'ez, which remains in use today as the liturgical language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. It minted its own currency, becoming one of the first sub-Saharan African states to do so. Its kings converted to Christianity in the 4th century, decades before the Roman Empire made Christianity its official religion. The conversion was not imposed from outside. It arrived through trade and intellectual contact, and was adopted by a king, Ezana, whose inscriptions shifted over time from polytheistic formulas to Christian terminology, in a sequence that historians can trace with remarkable precision through the surviving stone records. That continuity, from Ezana's conversion to the current practice of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, represents one of the longest unbroken religious traditions in human history. The church did not simply survive. It became the architecture of Ethiopian identity in a way that is difficult to fully understand from outside. It shaped the calendar. It determined the rhythm of daily life through fasting periods that occupy more than 200 days of the year for devout practitioners. It produced a literary and artistic tradition that generated illuminated manuscripts, ecclesiastical music, and architectural forms unlike anything produced elsewhere on the continent. And it retreated, during periods of political instability, into the landscape itself. There is a reason certain Ethiopian churches are not built on the land. They are built into it. Lalibela is a small highland town in the Amhara region, set at an elevation of approximately 2,500 meters, reached by roads that wind through mountain terrain with the particular slowness of geography asserting its own pace. The town is not large. Its permanent population is modest. It contains no airport capable of handling large aircraft, no broad avenues, no monument announcing its significance from the approach road. And yet it contains 11 monolithic churches, structures carved entirely from the living rock of the mountain on which the town sits, connected by tunnels and trenches and narrow passages, some of them descending 15 meters or more below the surface. The engineering logic is inverted. Rather than stacking material upward, the builders subtracted. They identified an area of solid volcanic rock and removed everything that was not the church. What remained were structures with walls, roofs, windows, decorative carved details, and interior spaces, all continuous with the mountain below them, all carved from a single piece of stone, all completed, according to the tradition, during the reign of King Lalibela in the 12th and 13th centuries. Whether the churches were built in a single reign or represent accumulated work across multiple generations is a question that remains genuinely open. The construction represents such an extraordinary volume of precise labor that historians continue to debate how it was organized, who directed it, and what tools were used. The churches show no evidence of trial and error. The proportions are consistent. The structural logic is sound. Whatever process produced them, it was not improvised. The largest, Betem Medhain Alim House of the Savior of the World, is thought to be the largest monolithic church on earth. It sits within a deep trench, its roof level with the surrounding ground, so that approaching it involves descending into the earth before the structure reveals itself. The experience has a particular quality that travel writing rarely captures accurately. It is not the visual impact alone. It is the combination of scale, silence, and the understanding that the mountain and the church are the same object. People still worship here, every day. On major feast days, the surrounding area fills with white-robed pilgrims who have walked for days through mountain terrain to reach this place. The churches are not historical artifacts. They are active religious sites whose relationship with the surrounding community is continuous with the original purpose for which they were carved. This is one of the things that makes Ethiopia consistently difficult to process through the frameworks most commonly applied to African history. There is no clear division between the ancient and the present. The past is not preserved separately from daily life. It operates within it. 12. 15. And the Ethiopian Orthodox Church marks time differently than the rest of the world. The Ethiopian calendar, derived from the ancient Coptic calendar, itself descended from the Egyptian solar calendar, contains 12 months of 30 days each, with a 13th month of 5 or 6 days depending on the year. The calendar runs approximately 7 to 8 years behind the Gregorian system, used by most of the world. When the rest of the world celebrated the year 2000, Ethiopia was still in 1992. When Ethiopia celebrated its own millennium in 2007, it did so with a particular pride that was not merely ceremonial. It was a statement of continuity, of a civilization that had maintained its own measurement of time across centuries of external pressure and internal transformation. This is not cultural stubbornness, it is cultural depth. The calendar is not simply a different way of counting days. It is a different cosmological framework, a different relationship between human organization and the movement of celestial bodies, maintained by an institution, the Church, that has functioned as the keeper of Ethiopian intellectual and cultural life for longer than most nations have existed. The Ethiopian day also begins differently. Sunrise marks the first hour, not midnight. When an Ethiopian tells you that something happens at 1 o'clock, they mean 1 hour after sunrise, which in a country close to the equator, where days and nights are roughly equal in length throughout the year, translates to approximately 7 in the morning by Gregorian reckoning. Two temporal systems operating simultaneously within a single country, a single conversation, a single exchange between a visitor and a local trying to coordinate a meeting time. It sounds like a small thing. It is not. It is a window into the degree to which Ethiopia has maintained the internal logic of its own civilization against the pressure of external standardization. That pressure has been enormous, and it has been resisted with a consistency that has no real parallel in the African context. Ethiopia is one of only 2 African countries never to have been successfully colonized by a European power. The other is Liberia, which was founded by freed American slaves and exists in an entirely different historical relationship with external authority. Ethiopia's resistance was military, decisive, and occurred at a moment when European imperial ambition was at its absolute peak. The Battle of Adwa took place in March of 1896 in the Tigray region of northern Ethiopia, during an Italian attempt to transform the country into a colonial territory. The Italian force, equipped with modern weaponry, confident in European military superiority, operating under assumptions about African fighting capability that history was about to overturn, was decisively defeated by an Ethiopian army led by Emperor Menelik II and Empress Taidu Bitol. The defeat was not marginal. It was comprehensive. Thousands of Italian soldiers were killed or captured. The defeat was so significant that it forced Italy to recognize Ethiopian sovereignty through the Treaty of Addis Ababa, signed later that year. The reverberations of Adwa extended far beyond Ethiopia. The battle became a symbol across the African continent and among African diaspora communities throughout the world, evidence, in a period when European colonialism was presenting itself as inevitable and even beneficial, that it was neither. The image of an African army defeating a European colonial force, at the height of European imperial confidence, was so disruptive to the prevailing narrative that it was systematically minimized in European historical accounts for decades. Within Ethiopia, Adwa is not a historical footnote. It is a foundation stone. The psychological relationship between Ethiopians and their own sovereignty, the particular quality of confidence, sometimes misread by outsiders as pride or insularity, is rooted in part in the knowledge that independence was not given. It was defended. And the defense was successful at the moment when success seemed most improbable. Empress Taidu Bitol deserves particular attention here, because her role in the victory at Adwa is both documented and consistently underrepresented in accounts that reach outside Ethiopia. She commanded her own force at the battle, participated in the strategic councils that shaped the campaign, and is credited by multiple historical sources with arguing against the Italian treaty terms that might have compromised Ethiopian sovereignty prior to the conflict. She was, in any period, an extraordinary political and military figure. Within the specific context of 19th century Ethiopian leadership, she represents something the wider world has not yet fully absorbed. The victory did not make Ethiopia static. It made it sovereign enough to continue changing on its own terms. Addis Ababa, the name means new flower in Amharic, was founded by Menelik II and Teidu in 1886, a decade before Adwa, in a decision that was partly practical and partly symbolic. The previous capital, Entoto, sat at a colder and less hospitable elevation nearby. The new city was established at a lower and more temperate site, on land that Teidu is said to have selected personally. From a small settlement, it expanded rapidly through the late imperial period and the 20th century to become the city it is today. The diplomatic capital of Africa, home to the headquarters of the African Union, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and more African ambassadors than any other city on the continent. The city itself is a study in layered time. Wide boulevards built during the Italian occupation from 1936 to 1941, the one period of external control, brief and bitterly contested, which ended when Ethiopian and British forces expelled the occupiers, run alongside neighborhoods whose spatial logic predates formal urban planning entirely. Orthodox churches sit at the centers of circular compounds ringed by eucalyptus trees, themselves introduced to Ethiopia in the late 19th century as a fast-growing solution to the deforestation that rapid urban expansion was producing. The eucalyptus solved one problem and created another, as introduced species often do, spreading beyond its original purpose and altering the ecology of highland areas in ways that continue to generate debate among Ethiopian environmentalists today. The Mercato district of Addis Ababa is, by most measurements, the largest open-air market in Africa. The designation is almost impossible to convey accurately in words, because the Mercato is not organized in a way that presents itself clearly to a visitor. It is a city within a city, thousands of individual vendors and small shops distributed across a dense, walkable area, organized loosely by category but not by any logic that becomes immediately apparent from the outside. Electronics, spices, fabric, livestock, gold, grain, coffee. The spatial density and sensory specificity of the Mercato is the physical expression of an economy that operates through networks of personal relationship, trust, and reputation, rather than formal institutional structure. Coffee is worth pausing on, because Ethiopia's relationship with coffee is not simply that of a producing country. Ethiopia is the place where coffee as a plant, as a cultivated crop, as a cultural practice, originated. The forest regions of southwestern Ethiopia, Kaffa, from which the word coffee is most likely derived, though the etymology is disputed, still contain wild coffee plants growing in their original habitat, genetic ancestors of every cultivated variety that has spread across the world's tropical belt over the past several centuries. The Ethiopian coffee ceremony is not a simplified ritual performed for visitors. It is a genuine social institution, practiced daily in millions of households, requiring between 30 minutes and an hour of focused preparation and shared consumption across 3 rounds of progressively weaker coffee brewed from the same grounds. The ceremony involves roasting green beans over a small flame, grinding them by hand, brewing the grounds in a clay pot called a jabina, pouring the coffee into small handleless cups, and distributing it to those gathered. Incense burns alongside the process. The ritual is governed by conventions of hospitality and social reciprocity that make refusing participation a meaningful social act. To participate in an Ethiopian coffee ceremony is not to experience a tourist attraction. It is to be absorbed, briefly, into a social logic that has been refined over centuries of daily use. The pace of the ceremony is calibrated to produce conversation. The 3 rounds create a structure that extends the gathering, deepens the exchange, and operates on a time scale that resists the compression that modern urban life applies to almost every other form of social interaction. In a country whose relationship with time is already different from the global standard, the coffee ceremony insists 3 times over that you are not done yet, that whatever you came to accomplish can wait, that this, right here, is also necessary. The landscape of the South tells a different story from the North, and understanding Ethiopia requires holding both simultaneously without allowing one to eclipse the other. The Omo Valley, in the southwestern lowlands near the border with Kenya and South Sudan, is home to a density of distinct ethnic groups and cultural systems that has no equivalent in such a small geographic area anywhere on Earth. Dozens of groups, the Mercy, the Hammer, the Karo, the Dasanak, the Bana, among others, maintain cultural practices, languages, and social structures that in some cases differ significantly from one group to the next despite geographic proximity. The valley functions as a kind of living archive of human cultural diversity, an area where historical isolation and geographic specificity produced variation at an extraordinary rate. The Mercy are perhaps the most widely photographed of the Omo Valley groups, largely because of the lip plates, large ceramic discs inserted into a cut made in the lower lip, worn by women as markers of social status and identity. The image of Mercy women with lip plates has circulated widely enough in travel photography to have become, in some contexts, as reductive a symbol as any other single image imposed on a complex reality. What the photographs do not convey is the social complexity within which the practice sits. The relationship between ornament and marriage, between bodily modification and community, standing between individual choice and cultural expectation. All of it operating within a community that has its own internal debates about continuity and change. What the photographs do not convey, also, is the pressure that communities like the Mercy are currently navigating. The establishment of national parks and conservation areas in the Omo region has in several cases displaced communities from land they have occupied for generations. Dam construction on the Omo River has altered the river's flood cycle, a cycle on which farming, fishing, and cattle grazing practices had been calibrated over centuries. The intersection of national development priorities, international conservation frameworks, and indigenous land rights in the Omo Valley is one of the most contested and least widely understood conflicts in contemporary Ethiopian life. Ethiopia is not a static civilization gracefully maintaining ancient traditions. It is a civilization in rapid, sometimes painful, often contradictory motion. The population of Ethiopia is approaching 130 million people, making it the second most populous country in Africa and one of the fastest growing populations on Earth. The median age is below 19 years. More than half of the country has no living memory of the 20th century's defining events: the Derg military dictatorship, the famine of 1984, the long wars with Eritrea. The Ethiopia that these young people are inheriting is different in its infrastructure, its connectivity, and its political temperature from the Ethiopia their parents described. but it is not yet clear what kind of country this demographic pressure will produce, or whether the institutions currently governing the country are adequate to what is coming. This question sits at the center of everything happening in Ethiopia right now, and it is not a comfortable question. Ethiopia's recent political history has been marked by genuine moments of transformation followed by catastrophic reversals that each, in their own way, seem to arrive without adequate warning from outside the country. The federal structure of Ethiopia divides the country into regional states organized primarily along ethnic lines, a design implemented after the fall of the Derg in 1991, intended to acknowledge the country's deep ethnic diversity and prevent the kind of centralized ethnic dominance that had characterized previous governments. The theory was sound. The implementation produced its own complications. When political competition maps onto ethnic geography, local conflicts have the capacity to escalate with a speed and intensity that purely ideological disputes rarely achieve. The optimism that surrounded Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's rise to power in 2018 was real, and in many respects, warranted. He released political prisoners. He made peace with Eritrea, ending a conflict that had technically continued since the 1998 border war despite the formal cessation of hostilities. He allowed exiled opposition figures to return. He spoke in a register that felt different from the security-dominated language of his predecessors. The Nobel Peace Prize awarded to him in 2019 reflected a genuine international reading of genuine change. What followed in Tigray beginning in late 2020 disrupted every hopeful narrative, including the ones that Abiy himself had constructed. The conflict between the federal government and the Tigray People's Liberation Front, a party that had dominated Ethiopian politics for nearly 3 decades before being displaced from federal power, escalated with a speed that overwhelmed international analysis. The scale of the humanitarian consequences, the documented atrocities committed by multiple parties, the weaponization of food access, the obstruction of aid delivery, all of it occurring within a country that the international community had recently celebrated as a democratic success story, produced a particular kind of institutional disorientation in the organizations and governments that had invested heavily in the optimistic narrative. The Pretoria Agreement of November 2022 formally ended the major hostilities. The process of accounting for what happened, the deaths, the displacement, the destruction of infrastructure, the long-term psychological and demographic consequences for the Tigray region, has barely begun. Accountability proceedings remain incomplete. Reconstruction has been uneven. The political relationships between Tigray and the federal government are being renegotiated in a context where trust is, at minimum, severely damaged. Ethiopia contains this, too. The ancient churches and the recent atrocities, the unbroken civilization and the recurring rupture. The capacity for extraordinary institutional continuity and the capacity for catastrophic institutional failure. None of these cancel the others out. They are all true simultaneously, which is precisely why a single story in either direction, celebratory or condemnatory, will always fail to describe the country accurately. Move south again, away from the political centers, and the land performs another transformation. The Bale Mountains in the southeastern highlands rise to over 4,000 meters and contain the largest area of Afro-alpine habitat on the continent. The ecosystem at this elevation is particular and strange. Giant lobelias rising several meters above the moorland like botanical monuments, The ground soft and cold and dense with moisture that the altitude preserves in a state of perpetual near frost. The Ethiopian wolf, the rarest canid on Earth, hunts here. It moves across the moorland in the early morning in the particular way of a predator that has adapted with extreme precision to a specific altitude and prey base. The giant mole rats that burrow through the Afro-alpine soil in high enough density to sustain a hunting population. There are fewer than 500 Ethiopian wolves remaining. The threats to their survival are well documented. Disease transmission from domestic dogs living at the edge of the national park. Habitat loss as agricultural pressure pushes upward from lower elevations. Climate change altering the conditions of the Afro-alpine zone itself. The Ethiopian wolf is one of those species whose situation illuminates the impossible arithmetic of conservation in a country with 130 million people, most of them, poor, many of them farming in areas that border critical habitat. None of them morally obligated to subordinate their food security to the survival of a predator species that competes at the margins with their own livelihood. The conversation about conservation in Ethiopia cannot be separated from the conversation about economic development and land access and historical injustice. These are not parallel conversations. They are the same conversation, spoken in different registers. The Simien Mountains in the northern Amhara region present a different version of the highland landscape, dramatic escarpments dropping thousands of meters to the lowland plains below. The edge of the plateau sculpted by millions of years of erosion into a series of pinnacles and ridges and sheer rock faces that carry the quality of a landscape that has been pushed to its logical extreme. The gelada baboon, found nowhere else on Earth, grazes on the highland meadows in troops that sometimes number in the hundreds. The gelada is the last surviving member of a genus of grass-eating primates. It spends more time on the ground than almost any other primate outside the great apes, moving across the highland meadows in a slow, deliberate pattern calibrated to the nutritional density of the grass it eats. Watching a large troop of geladas move across the Simien Plateau in morning light is one of those observational experiences that resists easy categorization. It is not dramatic in the way that predator-prey encounters are dramatic. It is quiet. It is sustained. It communicates something about deep time and the patience of evolutionary processes that a landscape without large animals cannot convey in the same way. The animals are indifferent to the observer. They were here before the observer arrived and will continue after departure. They belong to this specific place with a completeness that the human presence, however long its history in the same landscape, cannot quite match. The Simien Range also contains Ras Dashen, the highest point in Ethiopia at approximately 550 meters, a summit that does not announce itself with the theatrical isolation of a classic high peak, but instead rises from a plateau already so elevated that the additional height registers as gradual intensification rather than sudden drama. The mountain is climbed regularly but not heavily. The infrastructure supporting access is modest. The experience is defined more by the quality of the landscape through which you approach than by the summit itself, which is, perhaps, an appropriate metaphor for how Ethiopia rewards sustained attention more than brief encounter. The ancient city of Harar, in the eastern highlands above the Rift Valley edge, operates on a logic so different from the landscapes discussed, so far that approaching it requires a conscious recalibration. Harar is a walled city, the old town, called Jugal, enclosed within a wall constructed in the 16th century, and it is one of the most important cities in the Islamic world, containing more than 80 mosques within an area of roughly 1 square kilometer. It is considered by many Muslim scholars to be the fourth holiest city in Islam, a designation that reflects both its historical role as a center of Islamic scholarship and trade and the density of its sacred geography. The streets of Jugal are narrow to a degree that makes conventional urban movement impossible. They were designed for pedestrians and pack animals and the particular social choreography of a dense walled city, for passing a neighbor with a loaded donkey on a street barely wide enough for 2 people to walk abreast, for negotiating the right-of-way between a craftsman's open workshop and the doorway of a house whose threshold sits directly on the street. The spatial logic is Islamic in its origins, organized around the privacy of domestic life and the centrality of communal religious space. And it has been maintained with sufficient fidelity over 5 centuries that walking through the old city produces a spatial experience largely unchanged in its fundamental character from the city as it existed when the wall was built. Harar is also the city associated with Arthur Rimbaud, the French poet who, after abandoning poetry entirely in his early 20s, spent more than a decade in Harar, and Aden as a trader and gun runner, writing almost nothing. Apparently indifferent to the literary fame accumulating around the work he had left behind. The house in Harar where Rimbaud is said to have lived has been converted into a small museum, and the combination of objects, French literary reputation, East African trade routes, 19th century Ottoman influence, ancient Islamic scholarship, compressed into a single walled city in the Ethiopian highlands, is the kind of historical density that the country produces almost casually, without apparent effort. The Harari people, who have maintained this city across centuries of political change, are a distinct ethnic group with their own language, their own cultural practices, and their own relationship with the surrounding Oromo and Somali populations that make the region ethnically complex in ways that the simple designation of Harar as an Islamic city does not capture. The hyenas that enter the city at night, fed by hand by several families who have maintained this practice across generations, a tradition whose origins are disputed but whose continuation is not, are perhaps the most photographed expression of Harar's particular strangeness. The animals move through the streets after dark with a confidence that suggests their relationship with the city is not as exceptional as it appears to visitors. For them, Harar is simply a place where food is available and people are predictable. The strangeness, as always, is in the eye of the person arriving from outside. To the west of the Central Highlands, toward the Sudanese border, the terrain drops and softens, and the cultural atmosphere shifts again. The Gambela region and the southwestern lowlands operate in a different register from the highland civilization entirely. Lower elevation, different ethnic affiliations, different economic and agricultural systems, a historical relationship with the Ethiopian state that has been characterized more by peripheralization than by integration. The coffee forests of the Kaffa region in the southwest are among the most biodiverse in Africa, dense, multi-layered, organized around the coffee plants that grow here as part of a complex forest ecosystem rather than as a monocrop. The practice of forest coffee cultivation, in which coffee is harvested from wild and semi-wild plants within the forest rather than grown on cleared plantations, produces a different quality of bean and a different relationship between the cultivator and the land. The forest is not a resource to be cleared and replaced with productive agriculture. It is the productive system itself. Its maintenance is the economic logic. This distinction matters because it represents an alternative model of agricultural development that sits in direct tension with the pressures that are pushing Ethiopian smallholder farmers toward intensification and land clearing. The forest coffee of Kaffa is both an ancient practice and a contemporary argument about the relationship between ecology and economy, about whether the most productive system and the most sustainable system can be the same system, or whether development inevitably requires choosing between them. Ethiopia produces extraordinary quantities of coffee, teff, the grain from which injera, the sourdough flatbread that structures Ethiopian cuisine, is made sesame, pulses, and cut flours for the European market. The agricultural sector employs the majority of the working population and generates a substantial portion of export earnings. And it operates under the compounding pressures of population growth, land fragmentation as holdings are divided across generations, soil degradation, erratic rainfall, and the particular vulnerability of smallholder systems to commodity price fluctuations in markets they have no power to influence. Injera deserves its own consideration because in Ethiopia, food is not simply sustenance. It is the medium through which social life is organized. The injera, gray-brown, porous, slightly sour, made from teff flour fermented for several days before cooking on a large flat griddle, is simultaneously plate and utensil. The stews and salads and legume preparations that constitute Ethiopian cuisine are placed directly on the injera, and the meal is eaten by tearing pieces of injera and using them to scoop the food. The communal nature of Ethiopian eating, multiple people sharing from the same large plate, eating with their hands, feeding one another in a gesture called gursha that carries particular social significance, is made possible and structured by the physical form of the injera itself. This is a cuisine that has developed in a specific ecological context. Teff is extraordinarily well adapted to the Ethiopian highlands, tolerant of both drought and waterlogging, nutritionally dense, capable of being stored for extended periods. And that reflects in its form and its social function. Values of communality and hospitality that run through Ethiopian culture across its regional and ethnic variations. The Ethiopian highlands are cold enough at night that food has a warming function beyond simple nutrition. The stews, the wats, are spiced with Berber, a complex mixture built around dried chilies, fenugreek, coriander, and a range of other spices whose precise proportions vary by household and by region. Berber is not a recipe. It is a tradition, transmitted through observation and practice rather than written instruction, varying enough between families to make every household's cooking distinct while remaining recognizable as part of the same culinary system. A country whose cuisine is organized around communal eating, whose social life is structured by the coffee ceremony, whose religious practice commands more than half the days of the year as periods of dietary restriction, whose calendar places it in a different year from the rest of the world. This is not a country that has failed to modernize. It is a country that has made specific, continuous choices about what to maintain and what to release across a span of time that most of the world's nations cannot approach. The question is not whether Ethiopia will change. It is already changing at a rate that would have been unrecognizable to a resident of even 2 decades ago. The question is what the velocity of that change will preserve and what it will dissolve, whether the systems of meaning that have sustained Ethiopian civilization through centuries of external pressure and internal conflict are resilient enough to survive the particular kind of pressure that comes not from outside armies or imposed foreign rule, but from within. From the aspirations of 130 million people who want the things that the connected world has taught them to want and who deserve to have them. That tension between depth and velocity, between continuity and transformation, between a civilization's relationship with its own past and its negotiation with a future it did not design, is not unique to Ethiopia. But in Ethiopia, it is more visible, more legible, more ancient, and more acute than almost anywhere else on Earth, because Ethiopia has been here before, not in the same form, not with the same tools or the same enemies or the same internal contradictions. But the fundamental challenge of maintaining coherence across time, of remaining recognizably yourself while absorbing the pressures that each century delivers, is the challenge that Ethiopia has been answering for 3,000 years. The answer has never been simple. It has involved conquest and resistance, religious transformation and cultural consolidation, periods of extraordinary creative flourishing and periods of devastating collapse. It has involved the construction of monuments whose engineering confounds modern analysis and the perpetration of atrocities whose scale defies comfortable accounting. It has involved an unbroken conviction expressed in the architecture, the liturgy, the cuisine, the calendar, the legal systems, and the daily social practices of its people, that this place, this civilization, this specific way of organizing human life in this specific landscape, is worth maintaining. Stand at the edge of the Blue Nile Gorge in the early morning, when the mist is still moving through the lower reaches of the canyon, and the light has not yet reached the river far below. And what you are standing at the edge of is not simply a geographical feature. You are at the edge of a process, of water cutting through rock across millions of years of human civilization, building itself above and around, and in response to that geological fact. Of a river that has nourished and divided and connected the people of the highlands for as long as there have been people in the highlands. The river does not know its own history. The gorge does not care about the civilizations that have formed above it. But the people who have lived with both, who have built their churches into the rock and their cities on the plateau and their social life around the slowness of the coffee ceremony and the communal plate, they know. They carry it. Not as nostalgia, not as performance, but as the living infrastructure of a civilization that has simply not stopped. Ethiopia is not Africa's forgotten civilization. It is the civilization that the world forgot to notice, still here. Still arguing with itself about what it is, and what it should become, still carving meaning from the same ancient stone, still adding another ring to a history so deep that the bottom of it disappears into a darkness that even the Ethiopians themselves cannot fully see. But they know it is there. And that knowledge, accumulated across 3 millennia of continuous habitation, continuous practice, continuous argument with the terms of existence, is itself a kind of monument, not carved from rock, not visible from the plateau's edge, but present in the way that the oldest things are present, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the particular permanence of something that has survived long enough to stop needing to announce itself.